Australia is not a secular country. It is a free country.
What are the Liberal Party's policy failures? What are they misreading or failing to look after the right-wing base in this election, which will cost them votes?
Okay, well, I think part of the pragmatism in the Liberal Party stems from the fact that it's the middle-class party, and those of us who are middle-class are polite. We don't like to upset other people. And that means to a certain extent that we avoid arguments. Tony Abbott stood out because he was a middle-class person who was happy to have arguments. The result of not wanting to have arguments and that middle-class base is that there's a lot of people in the party who aren't in touch with the broader base, and basically get wedged by the ALP. The ALP set up a series of, or the Greens, a series of parameters, and these people aren't adept at arguing themselves out of those parameters. And once you accept those parameters, then it leads inevitably to a particular conclusion which you are on the wrong side of. Also, I think partly is a result of the occupational background of a lot of the members of Parliament from the Liberal Party, that they're not from occupations where you're out there arguing and trying to change the parameters so you can win the argument. Whereas on the ALP side, they're trade union backgrounds, school teachers, people like that. They're used to indoctrination, certainly having ideological arguments and fighting for their case. So that then means that, for example, 18C never got repealed, even though there's a lot of people around Australia who believe that you shouldn't be able to be pulled up for
hurting someone's
feelings. Yeah, exactly right. We've signed on to net zero by 2050. There's a lot of people who have problems with the if not with the climate change argument, with the policies being adopted to deal with it. Two separate groups there, really. The Liberal Party won seats in central Queensland on the basis of support for fossil fuels. A lot of those people must be feeling a bit nervous now that this net zero by 2050 is going to mean the end of their industry and their livelihood. What else haven't they stood up? Well, religious discrimination. Scott Morrison said he was going to legislate for it. He didn't. He kind of tried, but it was watered down pretty much by then because of the more moderate, more middle class, less wanting to have an argument, not wanting to upset people, hurt their feelings. COVID, we saw them basically ditch economic discipline in favour of helping anyone who said they needed to be helped and throwing money relatively indiscriminately around. The cost of funding COVID measures was about $800 billion according to the Parliamentary Budget Office when you factored in extra debt and so on by 2030. $800 billion when you scale it back as a percentage of the GDP is similar to what 1 year's worth of funding the war was in World War II. That has upset a lot of previously rusted on Liberal voters. It also cuts across the perception that this is the party of low debt and low taxes. You've probably seen some United Australia Party ads pointing out just how much the debt has grown under this government. So it's lacked...
it's cannon fodder for the alternative right-wing parties.
That's right. On defence, it's done okay. It's done better than the other side, but is it doing well enough? No, I don't think it is. Ordering nuclear subs that aren't going to turn up till we've gone net zero doesn't sound like a very good defence strategy to me, when you know that the challenge to us is likely to be in the next 10 years. Those subs, and that they're going to rely on rare earths that the Chinese have got a monopoly on. You know, you can't ring up your strategic competitor and say, look, would you mind sending me some more of those things so I can be more competitive with you? It's not going to happen.
Yeah.
There's a few areas where I think they've fallen down in terms of where the vast bulk of their voters are. I don't think they've also grappled with the fact that, as in the US, there's been a change in the class base of their vote, so that they're more likely these days to be comfortable in some working class, lower middle class seats than they are in the really high end seats.
This is a problem. Matt Canavan's identified this very clearly, and he's certainly able to be in the vanguard of where the Liberal Party should be going. And he's identified that the Liberal Party trying to hold on to inner city blue ribbon seats is a fool's game, because the inner city demographic has very firmly moved towards Green votes, whereas the working class, the blue collar, the regional people more than ever are feeling betrayed by the Labor-Green alliance, and much easier pickings for Howard's battlers, for Menzies' forgotten people, for Morrison's quiet Australians. They're not in the cities anymore.
Yeah, well, it's partly a function of, if you're going to live in the cities, especially in the inner cities, which have gentrified, they used to have a big working class component, but that's gradually disappearing. You have to be well educated, because education is the most common way that people attain wealth and status in our society. Not many people inherit it, some people do, but most people get it by either being in business or professions or management. And the education system doesn't value free speech and common sense like it used to.
Correct.
Whereas people out on the outskirts of town and in rural and regional areas, they're less likely to have been polluted by cultural studies or, whatever.
Feminist interpretive dance
theory. Yeah, all that sort of stuff. And they're also more in touch with how the world actually works. Because, if you're on a farm, you've got to be across a whole range of things, from international markets to how your tractor works, to meteorology, to supply chains, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So you have a much more holistic and realistic view of the world than someone living in the city who, might be a barrister specialising in criminal law. Well, might give you an idea of criminal law, but doesn't necessarily tell you how that shrink-wrapped pack of meat got on the shelf.
Yeah.
So you can believe some really silly things, like that we can just overnight power ourselves using wind and solar without any sort of credible form of backup.
Yeah.
So there's a groundedness out in the suburbs and outside that which there isn't in the inner city, which is not necessarily new. If you go back to Menzies in his Forgotten People speeches, he relates to that.
Yeah.
It's just that there's a slightly different class basis on it now. So, the Liberal Party perhaps has to face the fact it's not going to win some of its cherished seats, but that it may be exchanging those for seats that it would not have thought that it would win 20, 30 years ago.
I think they can swap seats. I don't think they need to lose seats as in numbers. Yeah, they're going to lose some seats, but I think they can pick up some seats that were previously Labor strongholds because of this change. And so I don't think there should be the renting of garments, sackcloth and ashes because they lose the seat of Brisbane. Because, sure, we should be able to pick up some of the outer seats, which you might not have been contenders for before that.
Yeah, but, if you take the seat of Brisbane, there's still a lot of working class people in there. And one of the things that I discovered in the Joe election win of 1974, which is now a long time ago, that in seats which...
For the record, prior to my time.
Prior to your time.
Prior to my first breath.
Well, I was still at school, I'll say in my defence, but looking at the figures subsequently, Joe got huge votes in Labor strongholds like South Brisbane. So there was a one-term member, it was a Liberal member because the Nationals didn't run in South Brisbane, member called Colin Lamont for South Brisbane, and it's the only time I think it's been held by someone who wasn't left of the spectrum. It's now held by the Greens. There was a guy called Bill Lamond who won the seat of Wynnum in the same election, and I don't think it's ever been held by right of centre before or since. So what you then realised was that some of these working class voters, given the right sort of right-wing candidate, would actually vote for them because they were voting for class reasons. They weren't voting for ideological reasons.
Yeah.
So there's still those sort of voters in seats like Brisbane, and the right sort of Liberal campaign might lose some of the sort of trendier demographics, but might actually be able to pull some of those away from Labor.
Yeah.
So they don't necessarily have to give up on these seats. But I think they need to more clearly articulate what it is that they offer that the Labor Party doesn't. And I don't think that they're doing that at the moment. I think that's a huge problem for them going into this election. There's a group of voters who normally vote Liberal who are saying we think they actually need a time in the sin bin, maybe. So it could be a bit similar to 1975, another election I suspect you weren't around for, but that was Gough Whitlam's, 1972, sorry. Gough Whitlam's, he lost in 75. A lot of Liberals voted for Gough because they thought it was time that the Liberal Party had, after 17 years or whatever it was in power, had lost its reason for being in power and its energy, and that it deserved some time out. Gough was so bad and the time so difficult that within 3 years he was out again, and the Liberal Party was back in with a landslide, historical landslide, or historic.
I am optimistic that a season or two with Labor will be just what the doctor ordered for A, the population, and B, the Liberal Party.
Well, there are parallels between what's happening now and then, because in 72 the Liberal Party was very centrist, and 75 Malcolm Fraser, who ran that election, while he got a reputation later for being a lefty because of his policies or his stand on refugees and Aboriginal issues, 75 was seen as being a right-wing ideologue. And under the influence partly of Dr. David Kemp, who had the so-called Kemp thesis, he actually tried to increase the difference between him and the Labor Party, rather than the policy before was to try and move into the centre. So it was kind of moving out to the edges.
I relate. I don't know what this says about me, but I relate to Kemp. Kemp, the Kemp thesis. I relate. Like, chasing the centre, I think, is foolish and dangerous. I think distinguishing yourself from the alternative is the key to securing a majority.
Yeah, well, it's the key to selling any product. Coke doesn't want to be doesn't want to be Pepsi, wants to be Coke. So yes, so I think that's the way back for them. But I'd have to confess I'm in the camp that says I'm not really sure whether they're different enough from Labor these days, and whether they haven't basically come to the end of the road in terms of this government, and they need time to refresh.
I think every Liberal Party MP, whether in any of the states or in the Federal Party, whoever feels themselves resorting to the line, but we're not as bad as Labor, or at least we're not Labor, It needs to give himself an uppercut. Like, that has to be the moment where you go, oh my God.
Putting my pundit's hat on, I think they're going to lose this election. The signs are everywhere. Conchetta Fierravanti-Wells' speech in the Senate last night, I think, just another sign. The fact that the New South Wales Liberal Party hasn't managed to pre-select its candidates.
Say?
Oh, she said Morrison was a bully. So we've had all this concentration on bullying in the Labor Party, and here you've got a Liberal senator bringing the focus back on the Liberal Party.
Wow. That is not going to be...
It's the sort of stuff that happens when
Wouldn't
you're
want to
falling
be
to
an EO
pieces,
in her office today.
falling to pieces at the seams. I remember 1983, so I was on the federal executive in 1982 and the Joint Standing Committee on Policy, and we knew we were going to lose the 83 election. In fact, I ran in that election for the Liberal Party in the seat of Griffith. It required an 11% swing for me to win it. There was no way I was doing it because I thought I was going to be a Member of Parliament. I was doing it because the only person they could find to run was a 25-year-old young Liberal federal vice president who just happened to live in the seat and said, yeah, if you can't find anyone, I'll give it a go.
Right.
No one was under any illusions.
That was you.
That was me. And at the Joint Standing Committee on Policy, you had people saying, well, why don't we do this and why don't we do that? And you say, but that wouldn't be responsible. And they'd say, yeah, but if they win, they'll be lumbered with it. And if we win, well, it's a bigger problem being out of power, so we'll do it. And I think with Julia Gillard and the NDIS, that was another one of those, well, I'm probably going to lose, but this will be a signature policy and I won't have to work out how to pay for it. And I don't know whether you noticed, but in the budget, some of the biggest increase in budget outlays was in the NDIS. It was obviously going to be a monster. It took things that the states used to do away from them and centralised it and made it a sort of universal right if you met certain criteria. And once you do that, all sorts of people will end up making the criteria because they can.
And expanding
Yeah,
them.
so yeah, I think there's a bit of, they know they're going to lose, so you're seeing all this ill discipline and things breaking out.
Strengths and weaknesses of the National Party.
Well, the strength of the National Party, in a sense, is that it's a vested interest more than it's a political party. The National Party was originally formed by rural interests who wanted to lobby for benefits for rural industries. There's a split essentially within the National Party between the large-scale farmers and the agriculturalists. That's an historic one, so graziers, wheat, they tend to think a certain way. They tend to be international in perspective because they're more likely to be exporting, whereas if you're running a orchard somewhere, your market's more likely to be local, you're more likely to be limited in terms of your capital, etc. Mm-hmm. So there's the sort of the two industry-based or broadly based within the party. These guys are protectionists. The other guys tend to be free trade. So there's been that tension in the National Party, but they tend to be more of the protectionists because there's more of those sorts of farms. So they've tended to dominate. The National Party has been decreasing in influence because the countryside has been depopulating, because the only way you can make money out of rural produce is by increasing your productivity, and that means increasing mechanisation. So the large rural workforces, which after the DLP split were the backbone of the Queensland National Party, they've gradually been moving to the cities where they've just become absorbed. And the Liberal Party has also, well, in Victoria they've always been competitive with the National Party just because of the nature of rural industry down there. In New South Wales there's been competition with Liberals owning country seats. In Queensland, with the exception of Groom, which the Liberal Party has fairly reliably held, but sometimes the Nationals have held the rural seats outside the city. So the Nats tend to be more prone to auction policies than not. So, they were terribly against net zero by 2050, and then suddenly they're all in favour of it because they get a couple of cabinet positions and so on. So,
Frustrating.
yeah, so, you know, if you live in a rural electorate, then you've probably got some traditional ties to the National Party, and you can rely that they'll put your interest ahead of anyone else's and their own above both. If that's not too cynical. So, and I think that's another reason why their votes sort of gradually been declining, because you can't in the modern era justify that sort of politics too well.
Let's talk about the strengths and weaknesses of the One Nation party and policy offerings.
Okay, so One Nation, in a sense, they get into that group. That's where they start. That's where the heartland is, that group which is becoming the new heartland of the Liberal Party, which is the outer suburbs and the rural and regional areas. Pauline Hanson, small businesswoman, fish and chip shop owner, from Ipswich, working class town, originally manufacturing town and coal mines. Her vote, strongest in Queensland initially, and it was outer suburban areas, did no good in the inner areas, didn't do very well with older people on the Gold and Sunshine Coast, so, but more working class, particularly male, in the outer, so areas like we're in here, Woodridge. Her vote sort of then would peak somewhere around the Brisbane Valley, and there was a peak up behind Cairns on the tablelands, and somewhere around Maryborough and places like that, there was also a bit of a peak. As it flowed up the Great Divide and went over the top, it would then start declining as you got out into the more grazing type large-scale agricultural areas where people had a different mindset. So she got a lot of working class people and traditional Labor voters, as well as traditional Liberal voters, which is why a 45-55 split was pretty common. So even though ALP would disown her, a lot of their voters, erstwhile voters, were actually voting for her. And she didn't make that big a difference, because a 45-55 split gives the Libs just a 10% advantage. It's not that much. She was originally almost a personality cult rather than a political party. And the party organisation was set up so that she ultimately had all control. She had members and she had supporters, and a lot of people who thought they were members were actually supporters, and they got no say in what happened. I think it's more democratic these days. Initially, her policy positions would have been mainstream in 1960s Australia, which I think is why she appealed to an older, kind of working class, less educated demographic. So she was a protectionist. She was in favour of regulation. She really didn't get the free market. Socially conservative. She also, had a lot of policies that, well, echoes of white Australia, which again was abolished in, I think, about 1967 effectively by the Liberal Party. But before that, it was Australia for the white man, and that was across both parties. Can you imagine if a politician today cracked a joke like two Wongs don't make a white, which a Labor Prime Minister did? You'd be cancelled immediately by both sides. Wouldn't matter how you voted.
Prime Minister
Your
was
feet just, I think it was Chifley. Or actually it might have been, was it Curtin? Anyway.
It was a Labor
it was a Labor leader.
Gotta love Labor.
But that was across the board. But Pauline Hanson was still in that mould. I don't think she is anymore. I'm not quite sure where she is. I think you've got to take account of the fact that Mark Latham, who isn't that sort of person, leads the party.
There are a lot of ethnic
Wales.
minorities who love One Nation and Pauline Hanson in particular, and have done for a while.
Yeah, well, so her original sort of fights were with Aboriginal welfare, and not welfare per se to Aborigines, but welfare they might get that other people didn't get. So it was an equity sort of argument, which resonated with a lot of people. And there may have been some racism under that, but I think it was more what about meism.
You don't think it was welfare for need as opposed to identity?
Yeah, I think that's where she was coming from. But, you know, I wouldn't swear that a lot of her supporters weren't nursing some racial grievances. And then that sort of played into, then she went after when she went into Parliament, she went after Asian immigration to a certain extent. And where she comes from, you know, we'd had big waves of Vietnamese and Cambodian immigration, which, you know, people felt they were prepared to work for. It was white Australia again. The worry mostly about people overseas coming here was that they'd undercut wages and conditions, and they'd take things away from the Australians.
Which isn't racist, it's protectionist.
Well, I guess the sort of racism one needs to be careful of is attributing particular characteristics to someone because they're a member of a race unjustly. There are some characteristics, you know, for example, if you're Kenyan, you're likely to be black. No one's going to say you're racist for saying that. But if you say, well, if you're Kenyan, you're stupid, well, that's obviously not justified. So, yeah, I think probably you're right that the hard-working attribute was justified, that all migrant groups tend to be like that. They come over, they've got nothing to lose, everything to gain, and they do whatever they have to do to get ahead and cement themselves. So that's not racist, but perhaps thinking that they're somehow going to steal something from you that they don't deserve, I think you're starting to verge on it. But anyway, those groups certainly saw her as racist. And the Liberal Party's association with her meant that the Liberal Party suffered in Brisbane and suburbs like Sunnybank, where you look at the size of the houses and you say, this ought to be safe Liberal territory, but it's not, because those groups saw the Liberals associating with Pauline Hanson, said that's racism. So Pauline had a big problem with that, but you know, Mark Latham, he doesn't fit into those characteristics. He's a free trader.
I think Pauline herself has also evolved since then.
I think she might have. You know, she's been around so she won her seat in 1988. We're now 24 years on.
And I hope that every single one of our politicians is able to mature and to say, you know what, I was wrong. Or maybe not that bluntly, or for at least to be able to say, you know what, there's a better way. I've reconsidered my position, and that wasn't as important as I thought it was.
I don't want to state this as a fact, but I think it would be interesting, and I think I've heard her talking about it, to talk about her experience in jail and how it might have changed her. So, you know, those sorts of things. And she would have come up, being in jail, she would have come up against a whole lot of Indigenous people because, you know, they are a large percentage of the jail population. You just can't get around it, disproportionate. And that's something that no one's got any right to be anything but ashamed about. But I think she may. I think you're right. I think Pauline has matured.
I hope I don't get to 60 or 70 and still as hard-nosed as I was decades earlier. I hope I soften.
She's still pretty tough, but you know, I think
nobody would accuse her of being soft.
The party's broad, and
she's softened.
I'm still not sure how democratic it is in terms of its internal workings and how much of a mass movement it is, or how much it's really centred around the
what are their strengths?
Cult of Pauline.
What is a right-wing voter going to be looking for when they choose One Nation as their number one vote? Because
it's more a cult of personality. The other person I haven't mentioned is Malcolm Roberts, who is, you know, very free trade and open markets, and who has particular positions on COVID and on climate change, which there's a large proportion of the Conservative base holds. So if you're voting for Pauline, to a certain extent, he's not up for election this time round, but to a certain extent you're voting to keep a structure in place that will bring Malcolm back. Pauline doesn't buy into those arguments, not that I've noticed.
Right.
Oh, she doesn't. Sorry, she does in COVID. Sorry, she does in
What about,
COVID. So that's probably, given that people don't vote for the entire party platform because no one in their right mind would. There's just too much there, and most of it won't get implemented anyway. You vote for the sort of the headline things. So yeah, there's a lot of people going to say, yep, she stands up for us because she's against vaccine mandates. If we want to hold the government or the opposition, because they've both been in it together, accountable for some of the miscalculations on COVID policy, then Pauline's one way of doing it. So I suspect that would be the really big pit.
Are there any of the minor parties, any of the minor freedom parties, which distinguish themselves from One Nation in any particular policy area?
Yeah, okay. So if we deal with the UAP, because it's a bit similar to Pauline, it's kind of Pauline with a couple of coal mines and royalties from the Chinese. So it's a personality cult around Clive Palmer. Clive's got much less personal pulling power than Pauline, but he's got a lot more money.
Fair.
And politics is kind of his passion. I was going to say hobby, but I think it's more than that. So he's spending a lot of money. He's a bigger than life personality. He's got a bit of the Donald Trump ability to say outrageous things that get people excited and talking about him. And while most people don't like him, he doesn't need most people to like him to potentially get a seat in the Senate, which is where he's aiming for. So Clive has been very much freedom, which is about COVID. He's also free markets and so on, but I'm not sure how deeply filled out his policy prescription is. I think it's pretty much what Clive feels on any particular day.
String of thought bubbles.
Yeah, but he's the kind of respectable rascal. Yeah, there's a fair bit of the Trump about him. So, yeah, I mean, he'll be fighting over the COVID vote with Pauline. I've been told that some Liberal Party polling shows that he might actually get into the Senate, but I'm a bit surprised.
Craig Kelly's running in the lower house, UAP, in New South Wales, as the leader of the United Australia Party.
Yeah.
Does he have a chance?
He could in Hughes. It's a outer metropolitan seat, which has a lot of the sort of people we've been talking about who are heartland for the Liberal Party, who are feeling that the Liberal Party is no longer representing their interests. So Craig, he's a man who is capable of creating a fuss and a scene and getting publicity. He's extremely vocal and persuasive on the issue. I think he is anyway on the issues he talks on. He's a bit of a terrier. He's off to one side as far as the mainstream media is concerned. They think he's a bit mad, although everything he's said about facts that I've checked has checked out. But that doesn't necessarily matter in today's world. So,
what about
he might win that seat?
Liberal Democrats. Let's talk about the Liberal Democrats option around the nation. They seem to be putting up some pretty good Senate candidates.
Yeah. So out of these minor parties, they're the one that I'm most confident looks like a genuine party, not a personality cult.
I kind of agree with that.
So they've got branch structures. They have centralised governance mechanisms. They select their candidates off some sort of membership ballot. They have a policy platform that's been determined by the members. They've got a broad membership, which skews a bit younger actually than some of the others. So One Nation skews older, the Liberal Party skews older, and I'm pretty sure the UAP would, but I'm not aware of any statistics I can peg my hat on. But I know that the Lib Dems skew a bit younger. They've only, if they get 3% of the vote in an election, they're doing well. I think they got about 1.5% last election. So, again, I don't think they're going to win any House of Reps seats, but they've got some prospects in the Senate, particularly in Queensland, where they've got Campbell Newman, former state premier, running for them. And Campbell will point out to you that even when he lost the state election in 2015, he had a larger first preference vote than anyone since has got, either winning or losing. And there was some polling done maybe 6-8 months ago showing that if he was in state politics, he'd be the most favoured person to be leader of the opposition. So he's still got a large following out there. To win in the Senate, you don't need 50% of the vote. You just, as I said, need a quota of 14. I think he's got quite a good chance. If he can keep ahead of United Australia Party and get their preferences, then I think he probably wins on the back of preferences from Amanda Stoker, who's the last candidate on the LNP ticket. And I think that with Campbell running, he's going to steal some votes from the LNP. Their vote will be down a bit. So she's the one at risk. I think what he might get, plus UAP, gets him in front of her. Her preferences go to him.
So you think Pauline's a shoo-in in Queensland?
Well, unless she gets starved of second preferences. Campbell might starve her of second preferences. Depends on the deals that are done. It really is that sort of touch and go.
John Ruddock in New South Wales?
Well, just before we finish with Newman, he's been quite strong on the vaccine mandates as well. So he's competing with UAP and Pauline on that. I guess the thing that he brings and that the LDP has that the others don't is that they're more a cosmopolitan party. They're not cosmopolitan in their outlook, they're nationalist. They believe that a nation isn't just lines on a map, that it's a state of mind, that being Australian doesn't mean that you've just hopped off a plane at the airport and you're here. So they're not what Mark Latham, what they call the anywheres, they're the somewheres. But, Campbell, small L Liberal, so on social issues, he's fairly, he wasn't against gay marriage, for instance. And the LDP, I think you'd find
that's actually
a very
going to be
strong...
his potential Achilles heel, is while he's probably got the same social conservatism as Clive Palmer and Pauline Hanson, he's well known as not being against some of those issues, which doesn't mean he's in favour of, but it's interpreted as he's in favour of.
That gives him an appeal over and above the... So if you're someone who thinks that you're pretty socially tolerant and liberal, but you're appalled at vaccine mandates, that gives him a point of difference from Pauline and Clive, which Pauline and Clive don't have from each other. So, I think those sorts of things play, and the LDP get their votes in places like the inner city, believe it or not. In Queensland, they're strong on the Gold Coast. They're strong in some country areas as well. And I'm not quite sure exactly what drives these things. I don't think there's any one demographic that they get, but there's a cluster of people anywhere you go who are basically libertarian in the US sense. So, just leave me alone, let me do what I want to do, and that's the way everyone ought to live their lives. So that's where the social liberalism comes into it.
I'm fairly sympathetic to that sentiment.
Yeah. Well, they're not conservative. They're genuinely liberal, but liberal in the classical liberal sense. And the difference between that and the conservative is the conservative is more invested in the institutions, whereas the classical liberal is less invested in the institutions. However, compared to the socialist or the Marxist, who wants to rip the institutions down, these two are still relatively close to each other.
This is, I mean, certainly with my audience, that's conservative Christians largely. It's the thing I want to explain is that right now, the battles we are fighting, we need like those battles have been fought and lost. Abortion, gay marriage, euthanasia.
Yep.
Those issues aren't issues we're fighting. It's now beyond looking to government for solutions and looking to us for solutions.
Yeah.
Therefore, especially because of that, but also because the battles are now on liberty and freedom, that is where we need libertarian governments like the LDP to maximise our freedom, win these battles that we're fighting now, which also consequently help us better fight those battles that have been lost. We can better, as communities, as Christians and congregations, be solutions to those cultural problems. The government doesn't have to solve everything, but what we do need is a government who will give us the ability to say the truth, our freedom of conscience, religious liberty, and essentially articulate persuasive arguments in those issues where government can no longer be the solution, or at least in the foreseeable future. But it's a bit nuanced and sophisticated when you're just thinking, but he's in favour of abortion or gay marriage.
Yeah, well, and what gets in the way is a lot of Christians are absolutist. And it's, to a certain extent, it's inherent in Christianity, because Jesus says, I am the way, the truth and life, and no man comes to the Father but through me. And so we've had doctrinal differences, and Catholics think they're the only ones going to heaven, and Protestants think the Pope's the Antichrist, although they take a more charitable view on Catholics' chances of getting to heaven, but still huge differences. And we've also had a long history of trying to force other people to accept our doctrines. And when you're in a position of power, which we have been in the Western world up until probably the 90s, then you could kind of have the luxury of freedom of speech and letting people blaspheme, for example. That's not something that they ought to be allowed to do. Whereas, I think the authentically Christian point of view, and the one that actually helps us all, is everyone's free to sin. Jesus never said to anyone, you have to do what I say. He said, this is what you should do. If you don't want to do it, that's fine, go your own way. And now that we're not in a position of power, those Christians who think they can enforce some sort of Christian morality or ideology or belief on other people have to understand that, no, that's not feasible. It was never right, but it's not feasible. And the Christian way of dealing with these things is to be like Jesus, to say, you're free to put me up on a cross and crucify me, if that's what you want to do under your laws. But you're not going to get the benefit from that. You're actually going to, put yourself in. As he would have said, I think eternal damnation. Christians are a bit scared of eternal damnation, the concept of hell these days, but Jesus wasn't.
No, that's right.
So, people have got to realise that we have got a vested interest in free will being accessible to all. And, free will is a key Christian doctrine, even if Jesus didn't enunciate it very clearly. St. Paul certainly did.
The Garden of Eden certainly did.
Well, yeah.
The choice was theirs.
Yeah.
Do or
well,
don't.
It was, yes, you're right.
Here's the boundaries. Stay in them or transgress them. Your choice. It's not an electric fence.
And I guess the other side of it is that there's almost a symbiotic relationship between people who do the wrong thing and people who do the right thing, in that you wouldn't have had crucifixion and Easter without Pontius Pilate and the chief priests and Pharisees.
Deeply existential questions.
So, you know, in a sense, God's working out of his salvation in the world requires some people to misuse their free will, because you wouldn't need to be saved if people
That's
hadn't.
actually the really right way of phrasing it. Misuse their free will. It's been, yeah, I mean, this is a big topic as well, which we won't indulge too much.
No, well, the thing...
But freedom has a purpose. It's not for indulgence, it's for service.
Well, if you weren't free, then you couldn't freely accept God. You'd be slaves, and that's not what we believe he's after.
Yeah.
And the cardinal sin, I think, in the Garden of Eden was, so it's not just any tree, it's the tree of the knowledge of fruit, of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, which is God's prerogative. So what they did was put themselves in a position to judge, which is God's judgment, God's position. And they then went from being, Milton's Paradise Lost is interesting in all of this. They kind of went from being not truly human to being human. In a sense, we can't be redeemed unless we have the capacity of straying.
Yep.
So the Garden of Eden, in some ways, you look at it, it was a necessity, and that's the kind of doctrine that Milton's got in his Paradise Lost.
Interesting.
And when they leave the garden, they go to work,
Yep.
which basically he sees as a good, not a bad.
Well, yeah.
Anyway.
Well, there was work in the garden.
You might use that clip for something else.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, sometimes it's just fun to have the conversation socially. Katter's Australian Party? Oh.
Yeah, okay, Katter's. So Katter's interesting. In a sense, I was going to say cult of personality, but it wasn't really. It was just an independent. So, he became the independent member for Kennedy. I'm just trying to think when Katter's Australia Party actually became a party, but I think it might have been after Pauline Hanson. And you might notice a lot of the minor parties were named after someone.
Vanity names.
Well, it's because the person had the brand, not the party.
Yeah.
So, if you called it the Central Queensland People's Party, big deal. Katter's Australian Party, oh, yeah, that's the guy in the big white hat.
Clever marketing, but it...
Well, it was Darren Hinch's Justice Party and
Jackie Lambie and
Network and Xenophon.
Xenophon, yeah.
He actually changed his name ultimately of the party. But so that was part of the marketing strategy, and that kind of signalled this is about a personality. Bob was more organic in that he was there, he'd been there for quite a long time, and then it sprang out of it. His son Robbie runs the state party, but I think without having studied its constitution that it does have some democratic structures and some sort of way of determining policy which isn't just what Bob thought was a good idea when he woke up that morning.
Yep.
And it also fills a gap that the LNP left when the Liberal Party and the National Party merged. So the big risk when the Liberals and the Nationals merged was that people who had voted National because they didn't like the Liberals would find they had nowhere to go. The Liberals would kind of colonise the Liberal National Party. And the Liberal National Party is actually a division of the Liberal Party, even though some of its members sit in the National Party party room down in Canberra. Katter's actually, I think, picked up some of those people who were disenchanted when the National Party moved in with the Liberal Party. But he's very geographically confined. So,
yeah,
he'll get up. No two ways about that.
Yeah.
Will there be a successor to him? Because I think he's about 78 or something like that now. He can't have too many rounds left in him. And is there a chance of a Senate candidate? I wouldn't have thought so, but...
The Democratic Labor Party, are they nationwide?
I don't think so. And I don't think they're really the DLP that people in the 60s, 70s and 80s knew either. I think it's pretty much had its day.
Shooters, Fishers, Farmers Party?
Yeah, they're a party that will get some Senate votes in different states. They don't have any sort of clear charismatic leader that I'm aware of. They seem to be able to run contradictory policies side by side in state elections. So I think they're more a protest party than anything else.
Yep.
You know, there are certain voters and there are certain times when voters want to send a message to the major parties and they'll grab a minor party that's available to send that message. And they don't mean that they approve of that party, they mean they disapprove of the other parties. So I think the Shooters, Fishers and whatever fit into that kind of mould. So they were a way of sending the National Party principally, I think, in the last New South Wales state election, a message. They polled okay.
Do the parties hear this message?
Oh, if you think you're going to lose a seat because of them, yeah, of course you do.
But is there any...
I mean, John Howard heard the One Nation message. I mean, that's what marginalised Pauline after 98.
So here's my worry, and you know, that's a great example of them hearing the message. What about the West Australian Liberal Party? They've been devastated, eviscerated, and the rhetoric coming out of the party after that was that it was the fault of the Conservatives, rather than acknowledging it was their lack of appeal to Conservatives, which cost them that vote.
If they don't hear the message, then they'll stay irrelevant and someone else will fill the vacuum, because there's always going to be a place for right of centre views, however they're defined in any particular context. So if they don't pick it up, then someone else will. And you can look to Canada for examples of that, because the Progressive Conservatives there went down to, I think, 2 votes when Kim Campbell was...
Is that an actual party name?
Yeah.
Progressive Conservatives?
Well, that's because Conservative isn't an appealing name to a lot of people in the electorate, because it says you're stuck in the past. And Robert Menzies, when he set up the Liberal Party, said we're not a Conservative party, we're a Liberal party, because we look to the future, we're in favour of progress. So there's always been a little bit of...
marketing.
Yeah, and nervousness about being tagged as people who just want to preserve things. You know, in the UK, the Conservatives are the Conservatives, and possibly partly because of the legacy of Margaret Thatcher, they're not seen as being necessarily holding on to the past. But anyway, in Canada, they call themselves the Progressive Conservatives. Kim Campbell was the leader and they went down to 2 votes. You've now got a range of sort of right-wing parties there and so on that have filled some of the gaps that they left.
Yep.
So Western Australia, you know, the National Party might fill the gap, or if they keep losing, then the people who are doing the losing...
Does the National Party contend in Australia, in Western Australia?
They're the official opposition.
Ah. Okay, great.
Eventually they'll get the message. You know, political parties, especially the ones that have been around a long time, have been there because they're capable of shifting and reading the signs and not being marginalised for too long.
Yep. Well, hopefully the Liberal Party can read the tea leaves. I don't think they'll do so in time for this election, but...
No, I think... Morrison won a bare majority. He was lucky to get there, and I think, though, that he's governed as though he was a minority government. And he's been very, very timid in how he's governed. And I contrast that with Peter Beattie in Queensland. So I think it was 98, he won a minority government. He governed like he had a huge majority, even though he had a scandal with the Shepardson inquiry in the middle of it. 2001, he won 14 seat, I think it was, majority. He didn't let it get in his way. He just ploughed ahead. Morrison hasn't. And I think that's why he's not going to win the next election.
Yep. Final question, if you were to somehow have Morrison's ear over dinner, quiet opportunity, or even a long meeting, and he basically gave you the ability to choose major innovations, changes of direction, policies, campaign strategies. If he said, Graham, we're going to lose without you, what do we have to do to win? And whatever you say, we're going to do it. What do you reckon would, if anything could, guarantee Morrison a victory at this next federal election?
I think he's probably beyond help, because anything that he said which was a radical change of direction would be interpreted by the electors as desperation.
But let's say he's got the ability to do a Peter Beattie mea culpa.
Well, he had to be doing it all the way along. And what he had to do was he had to get that legislation through on religious discrimination, for example. He shouldn't have signed up to net zero by 2050. He should have turned the conversation to the practicalities of going all electric. And he should have pointed out the geopolitical realities, that it doesn't matter what we do with emissions in Australia, because if the Chinese and the Indians keep burning coal as they intend to, then all we're doing is sending our emissions over there and re-importing them as goods. And he should have been talking, and he should have had as part of his overall approach defence in a much stronger way, because that is an existential thing that we're in, and it changes, as we're seeing with Ukraine, how you look at the issues of fossil fuel and power security. You know, we're sitting down here thinking, well, we've got the luxury to tinker around with our power. We don't. So he would have been on those sorts of things. He would have been doing something about education. We have some of the same issues here that they've got in the US. It's not as bad, but it will be as bad. You know, it's people being taught essentially cultural Marxism. It's kids being sexualised by, you know, we used to regard sex education as something that parents were supposed to do.
100%.
Schools only stood in to a certain extent. They had to get the permission of the parents to talk about these things to kids. Now it's being incorporated all over in the curriculum.
Yeah.
And children are getting the idea that somehow sex is far more important than it ought to be, and that your sexuality is what defines you. It isn't what defines you. It's part of what defines you, but it's not what defines you. It is not the major thing. So he should have been buying into the education argument. With COVID, he should have had a much more transparent process. He probably shouldn't have got involved in that silly national cabinet, which just allowed the premiers to tell him what to do and then run back to their own states and criticise him for not doing enough. The federal government should have been far more parsimonious in the handouts that it gave. There needed to be some support, but I think we would have got much better policy if there'd been less government around and people having to rely on their own resources, because they would have pretty quickly decided that locking the whole economy down and having a gap year wasn't the right way to deal with a disease which we knew after 3 or 4 months of statistics.
Correct.
It wasn't the Black Plague, it wasn't even the Spanish flu, it wasn't normal flu. It was certainly, I'm not trying to minimise it, it was more serious than that. But the old traditional methods, which was in fact laid down in the manuals as to how we ought to deal with a pandemic, of isolating those people that were at highest risk and letting the rest get on living their lives as they saw best, was the way to go, and that people should have been living as much as they could off their own resources. and that would have sharpened their minds in terms of how they ran their lives. Instead of that, he went along with the playbook that admittedly a lot of people in the Western, a lot of governments in the Western world did, but
Yeah.
you know, a lot of his base knew it was the wrong thing to be doing. They know it's the wrong thing to have done now, and it just plays into the perception that the government's weak.
Yeah.
You know, there's a number of things. If I were doing the budget, and I thought about this the other day, we now have a supply side problem. We've got people who want to spend money, but we don't have enough goods. We had a growing problem before of a decrease in productivity, and that reflects in no increases in wage, no real increases in wages, or very, very small increases. That's because of a whole lot of regulation that's happened in the economy. You know, some of it being paperwork regulation, others restricting businesses from what they can do. Mm-hmm. I would have been looking to cut those. Maybe a Donald Trump program that for every one regulation you implement, you've got to cut 20 or
2.
What? Was it only 2?
Yeah.
I thought it was 10 or something like that.
He far exceeded those goals.
He far exceeded it. Okay, all right, far exceeded it. But that would have been part of it. I think I would have been radically looking to decrease company tax, because basically the way company tax operates here is that the dividends get passed through and you pay at your own marginal rate, and if you don't have a marginal rate because you're too poor, then you get money back from the government for what the company paid. So what stays in and gets taxed at the company rate is basically the money that companies invest in themselves. Well, you take the company tax off, there'll be a lot more investment happening, you get a lot more growth in the economy. And I would have been looking at ways of paying back the debt faster, trying to at least not grow the public service, because again, the public service is a dead weight on growth in the economy because it's redistributive. Now, you need redistribution in economies, but you don't want too much of the economy being involved in redistribution. You want as much being involved in production as you can. And I probably, another policy would have been to extend accelerated depreciation. Basically say to businesses, depreciate at whatever rate you want. Again, that would encourage investment, because that would mean that you could go out and buy a tractor, or you in your studio here, you could go and buy some equipment instead of depreciating it over 3 years or whatever the depreciation rate is in your industry. Write it off next year, comes straight off your tax. From your point of view, there's a big benefit there, and you can start earning money faster.
And with the studio technology, it pretty much does need replacing
every year. Right, okay. From the government's point of view, yeah, you're not paying as much tax this year. In next year, you're going to be paying more because you'll have lost that depreciation. So instead of you spreading the depreciation out over 3 years and them getting tax over 3 years, they'd miss out on tax this year. They get a lot more tax these 2 years, but hopefully, because you'd had the confidence to go out and buy this, you'd be making more money anyway, so they'd pick up the difference.
And or you get to survive in order to pay tax.
And that would appeal to that small business, outer suburban, aspirational class, a lot of whom are in businesses, and they'd see the opportunities and they'd say, thank goodness there's a government that cares about us. So, you know, they'd be some of the policies. And I'd also, wouldn't be in the budget, I think I'd announced that I was going to immediately pass, he wouldn't get away with that, immediately pass legislation in the next Parliament to outlaw vaccine mandates using the external affairs powers and the corporation powers. Maybe it's the Pauline Hanson.
I think that would guarantee him a win alone.
No, I think it's too late now. I think it's too late. He's shot all his bolts. He hasn't shown the courage that he needs to show, and
he's painted himself into a corner, pretending that he can't.
I think just looking at him and Josh Frydenberg together, Frydenberg fills his suit out Morrison doesn't. There's just, I think, a bit of imposter syndrome with Morrison that there isn't with Frydenberg.
Yeah.
And I think that's dogged Scotty from marketing all through his prime ministership, that he never quite looks the part. He looks as though he's trying too hard to convince people.
Yeah.
It just doesn't bring that gravitas with him that, you know, might be unfair, but that's what we look for from leaders.
Yeah.
And that's one of the reasons we've got problems with our national security, because the American president doesn't look or sound or act like a leader.
Yeah, he's no hard to take seriously.
And that's a problem Albanese's got too.